So good morning and welcome to this webinar entitled When Your Business is on the Production Line. This is a joint webinar today between Agile Solutions and Informatica. We've been running a series of webinars throughout 2019 and here through 2020 on the subject of something we call data management culture. Last year we were talking about the attributes of that and what that looks like. This year we're focusing on examples of organizations and how they've been taking some of these ideas and concepts and deploying them into their business. So we're trying to make it a bit real. And today we're going to talk about organizations which are in the manufacturing sector and how they're taking a lot of these things that we talked about last year and how they're putting that into practice. Firstly, let's do a few introductions. My name is Andy Joss. I look after the business value and data governance business across Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America for Informatica. And I'm joined this morning by Mel Parker from Agile Solutions. Mel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andy. Yes, I'm Mel Parker and I work for Agile Solutions and I head up the data strategy and data governance practice there.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so let's get cracking. Let's have a little bit of the background as to what's gone on. Now, clearly, the world is in a much changed place compared to where we were at the beginning of 2020. If you then kind of look at some of what we call the environmental challenges, and that's really reflecting some of the shorter term issues that we've been having to face, given what's happened through the pandemic. And this isn't all of them, but actually just thinking about what's happened around local and global supply chains, how industries across the globe have coped and responded to what's happened. Thinking about what's happened from a staff and employee viewpoint in terms of either the shift to working at home or people being furloughed, and unfortunately in many cases we've seen organisations shedding people too. Also thinking about how we get people back into physical environments, so being able to work safely in a way where people have confidence that they can start to return to some degree of normality in the way that they were working. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that there's been a downturn in many local and global markets, but clearly there are many industries which have survived and thrived during the pandemic because of the way that they structure themselves or their particular offering and go to market. And the big question, of course, many manufacturers are asking is when will normality return so we can start to get back to doing the things we do in the way that we use them. So there have been some very significant environmental impact, but of course industry itself is going through transformation. And there's what we call the business as usual challenges as well. So, issues around getting the right skills in the workforce. Can we get sufficient people with the right skills in the right places to deliver the innovation, the products, and manage the supply chain in a way that we can actually offer the right services and goods to our customers at the right price point? Just thinking about how technology plays a role in terms of how organizations are changing and the level of automation that then gets applied to that in terms of how we can be much more efficient, but also a lot more innovative. And just thinking back to the early days of the pandemic, how many industries and businesses turned their hand from doing what they traditionally did to suddenly being able to ramp up very quickly to create new capabilities such as face masks, for example, in very short order. The ability to respond and build that kind of capability and get it to market really quickly, but just on a general industry scale. But also thinking about the depth of the supply chain and the visibility we have in the supply chain. And clearly that's been quite interrupted, but actually the need to manage that still hasn't changed, nor has the whole issues around energy and energy management, but also then thinking about managing materials. Clearly during the pandemic, there were some materials which were quite hard to get. Prices were fluctuating, in many cases going up quite significantly. So how do we manage all of these issues? Again, the things that we've been managing as an industry for some period of time. Then thinking about the geopolitical pressures, thinking about the slowdown in Industry 4.0. In some cases that absolutely has been the case. In others, maybe we're going to see an acceleration. And of course, customer demand. That being fueled by so many different expectations and the need to have a great deal of things like customization, significant price points, service delivery, all of those kind of things built together. So as an industry, we've had those business as usual challenges, but in slightly different shapes and forms, but they really haven't gone away. And really that last point about customers is, I think, one of the things that we're seeing is that the needs of customers are changing quite significantly too. And when we think about some of those customer-driven shifts, Here's a few examples, and that kind of Amazon effect is the way we've got. And obviously, we're familiar with Amazon as an online marketplace, but that ability to easily and seamlessly shop and transact at the speed with which you get delivery, the ability to bring in third parties, and the visibility of the process. We're starting to see that applying in so many different industries that we never had before, but also thinking about the time pressures on the whole of the supply chain, that kind of need it now, want it now type environment, and also availability. We're now seeing so much competition coming in from other markets with very, very rapid transit times, good price points, means that suddenly global market availability is very attractive from a customer viewpoint. So we have to think about how customers perceive that. And of course, smart everything and product customization. Product customization, of course, doesn't necessarily apply to every industry, but actually, customization in some way, shape, or form does influence a lot of the thinking and way customers buy products and about what sorts of products they buy. And of course, last, but smart everything. Not everything needs to be smart, but some things do, and some things need to be smarter. So it's about how we build all of this in to ensure that those customer-driven shifts are then reflected in the products and the services that they then bring to market. And actually, one of the things that we see actually relatively consistently is actually many manufacturers just can't respond or innovate fast enough. So that's a major challenge and something we alluded to a little bit earlier. But they need to do that because of those customer-driven shifts, because they need to keep themselves relevant, and they're up against nimbler, maybe smaller, but more focused and niche players, many of which are eroding market share and, of course, taking margin for many organizations. So actually, manufacturers are looking at a whole range of environmental, industry challenges, customer changes, technology changes, and thinking, how on earth do we respond to that? And that's really where data management culture comes in, to help organizations on that journey to get value from data. But actually, the really good news, and I think we've seen a few examples of this during the pandemic, is actually there are organizations, which we've seen quite publicly, where they are seeing major benefits from some of the shifts that we're talking about, whether it be through operational efficiency, which in many cases will lead to cost reduction. Now, clearly what's happened, most organizations would want to reduce cost, but actually just being more operationally efficient very often will lead through to service as well. Some organizations are absolutely thriving, and therefore this is about sales, leading to improved revenues. Margins have obviously been a topic for many organizations, and of course market perception. So potentially there's some really positive benefits from looking at the changes that the industry is going through and the role that data plays, and how data management culture supports organizations getting value from their data. But I guess that in simple terms, we see manufacturing as being in the midst of many different but interrelated global digital transformations. So maybe the current climate is going to accelerate how we as an industry respond to that. So let's talk a little bit about the role of data management culture. So we did a series of webinars on this last year. So today we're not going to go and recover all of that content again. The links to that will be available after the event. But suffice to say, part of the idea of data management culture is about organizations really understanding the value of data and ensuring holistically that they use data to manage their business, to help deliver and drive not just the data strategy, but the business strategy too. For us, it's about finding the right tactical and strategic balance of the needs of the business with the data and the data capabilities the business has, and how those two interlink. So this could be, and for many organizations, it'd be a complex process management. And the reason for that is maybe it's something that's kind of fairly obvious. For many businesses, depending upon organizational structure, there may be competing priorities. We've already talked a bit about skills and resource constraints. Many industries are really suffering from lack of skills or lack of the right skills in the right places. Budgetary challenges, again, through what's happened, many industries are really suffering around cash flow, collaboration and collaborative options in terms of getting the different parts of the business working together in a much more seamless, joined up way. Again, it can be quite challenging. Organizational structure sometimes plays a role in helping drive an organization towards doing some things, but actually the change between running the business and the physical change of the business, putting all of these things together for many organizations, gosh, we're trying to do a lot of things at the same time. We're not trying to address a lot of challenges at the same time. And actually, I would argue that one of the key requirements behind all of that is data. So this is a high-level view on some of the key capabilities we see as being part of a data management culture. And again, we're not going to go through that in detail today. What I would say, though, is that when you look at all of these capabilities kind of holistically, and you think about how this then applies to manufacturing as an industry, and clearly it's a broad term, manufacturing, there's lots of different types of manufacturing, but we look at some of the key issues and requirements that industry sees and the role that data plays. So let's look at, for example, supply chain optimization. We've always been trying to optimize the supply chain, but actually now we probably have a requirement to do that in a lot greater detail, at a lot greater speed, and with a lot more efficiency than we've ever had there before, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about. Operational efficiency has been a massive driver for every organization, kind of forever. But actually what's just happened means that we actually have to go back and rethink how we're going to be a lot more operationally efficient and the role that data plays in driving that efficiency. And of course, we've got some technology change, such as particularly around 5G, I guess, although many of us are still dealing with 4G, and the whole high-speed communications marketplace, and the role that plays in terms of the ability to move data and move products, goods and services around and do that interaction at really high speed. Again, related to technology, we talked a little bit earlier about smart things, but the role of the Internet of Things and the role that artificial intelligence, machine learning has been playing in terms of how we get new products and services to market, but also how we keep them in that market and keep them operating efficiently at the right price point. But then moving to a lot more of a real-time predictive world, where rather than looking is just historically, we're looking into the future as well to help make those right decisions. With all this change that's going on, data plays a critical role of that. And of course, the role of augmented reality and virtual reality in terms of how we go about what we do, or what we convey, that what we do to our customers. So data is a very, very significant part of everything that's going on and some of the key challenges in manufacturing. I guess for me is the fact that most organizations I talk to, they're trying to deliver against all of these requirements at the same time. So that's clearly going to be a significant challenge. So what we're going to do today was to give you two examples of how organizations are taking a lot of the things that we talked about and looking at all the challenges that we talked about, and how they're taking data management culture and the ideas that sit within that and making that real. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Mel, and Mel's going to walk you through a couple of examples, really just to give you a flavour of this. This isn't just some nice idea. You know, there are world-class leading organisations who are already on this journey, and we'll take you through a little bit of how they're doing it, why they're doing it, and more importantly, where it's going to take them to. So with that, Mel, I'm going to hand over to you if you can take us through those examples, please.
Great, thanks, Andy. Okay, so the manufacturing industry that we will explore today is made up of two very distinct multinational companies. The first one being around defence and security, so they're mostly focused on the aerospace industry. They have a focus on improving quality, effectivity and control. The second one is around construction and agricultural equipment company, and they have a focus on improving their own assets and thinking about innovation for the future in order to do that company growth. So if we take the first example, in terms of the aerospace and defence company, and so they have a lot of business challenges from having a multitude of different needs and requirements, but also with a lot of suppliers. These guys, they have a significant number of suppliers to manage the vast supply chains in terms of their parts and where they actually source them from. So in order to reconcile the data that they actually need to manage these things, one of the challenges is the ability to reconcile any changes with parts in terms of the overall inventory and order control. Secondly, they had to think about the US export, really think about those parts and how they were going to be used and how that was going to be signed off from a legal marking perspective. Secondly, it's all really about assets and asset control. So for locations and buildings and postcode and address data, a lot of the reference data that they needed to manage, including legal entity information and supplier information, was proven a challenge because of sort of manual data entry and the non-ability to ensure that they had a golden record. Finally, it was really about understanding some of the traditional business processes from the manufacturing order to then look at thinking about how could they improve what those look like from a user-centric position. So the types of data management capabilities that they would use was actually three in this instance. Data quality management, so they needed to understand, could they profile some of that data to find out where some of the challenges and issues were, how were they going to put into some remediation, some data cleansing and improvement techniques. Secondly was the data catalogue, which is about, could we understand what data we used, where were all those inventories of information held, could we have a view on those, even with security considerations, how do we understand through the metadata where most of the data resided. And then finally, business glossary, which at the time was really to start thinking about those data definitions, really putting some understanding, some collaboration around the terms and understanding what kind of data that they actually had. So in terms of the outcome for that then, so a lot of the manual work and effort that was placed upon this was significantly reduced. They had a lot more reusable data capabilities, including data preparation. Collaboration became a little bit easier because again, they had reusable terms. They didn't have to keep doing the same thing at the same point of every new project. And this was easily accessible across multiple program work streams. And then eventually had a much better understanding of the data landscape. But not only that, because of the user-centric capabilities being deployed, a lot of the business processes were able to then start thinking about actually how do we do a digital transformation or make information and knowledge management a lot easier for an employee and their sort of persona, and how we're able to drive it for that significant role. So the second case study, thank you. So the second case study was all around construction and agriculture, and the business challenges here were similar, but however they were trying to really reconcile a lot of terms. So they didn't have as much data per se as the first case study, but their definitions and how they understood those terms across the business widely varied. They had a lot of acronyms, as with quite a lot of companies. How do we actually understand what the data is telling us from a business perspective when we only understand acronyms from actual physical and technical databases? The ability to discover data and reuse what was already available was quite challenging as well, because again, with varying terms, they didn't know if they had duplicated data or the ability to reuse what they already had. So the challenge being is they needed to improve the decision making and insight in order to explore those innovations that I was talking about before. Andy had alluded before to Industry 4.0 and the use of IoT. Well, a lot of telemetry information and data is coming through for smart machines. So again, this company wanted to understand what was the innovation, what was the actual impact of the use and explosion of these types of technologies. So the two capabilities that they started off with is business glossary and again data catalog. But in this instance, how do those two data capabilities help the client? Well, from this perspective, they reduced time spent on a lot of sort of manual data finding, and then the focus was moved from trying to understand what data they had to much more higher value activity. So this was more spent on more quality analytics, being able to really drive forward that decision-making ability. Recognition, so this was more around the proactive management for really handling data governance as a foundation for their analytics and machine learning, as opposed to being very reactive and trying to fix, say, data quality issues downstream. The whole point of this bit meant that we were able to apply a lot more strategic value to what it is that they were trying to drive. So if the analytics needed investment, what kind of key metrics and value could we then assign to those data assets? So it wasn't just about operational KPIs, but actually looking at data as a corporate asset and how it was very much important to the overall value supply chain that they needed moving forward. So there were some key takeaways from both of these examples that really resonated with us. So the first one was around organisational, operational ideas, and this is really always been the same, which is never underestimate the importance of people. You really need a good, successful data management and governance team that really understand the nitty-gritties of the end-to-end. You're always going to have really good skill sets within siloed pockets, whether that be analytics or whether that be in architecture, but the idea is to really bring this together. So the only way we can actually do that properly is through some change management and regulatory compliance that forces those two things together. From a process and architecture point of view, we all know that product specifications do change over time. Parts do, products do, and even the demand do for their original purposes. However, being able to understand how the underlying data changes over time with that, so we talked in previous webinars around the idea of a digital twin, you should be able to then gain visibility of where that data lineage is to ensure that we can actually be a lot more proactive and flexible to be able to deliver not only the data to the right people at the right time, but ensure those products and parts can really assess where they're being used rather than starting from scratch. It reduces a lot of waste in that space. And I'll hand you back to Andy, who will just finish off for us.
Perfect, thank you very much, Juan. I thought it was some great examples there of how different organisations in quite different parts of the industry are seeing a lot of commonality in terms of how data is being used and the types of outcomes that they're trying to drive. And outcomes is clearly the most important part of why we're doing this. So let's have a quick summary on kind of thinking about what we've been talking about and where this takes us. So I think for us, the fact that many manufacturing organisations, when we talked about all these requirements, these challenges, the fact that we're trying to deliver against all of these requirements, many, if not all of them at the same time, means that businesses are now looking at data as a really important part of the strategy of how they're going to respond to all these different changes that are impacting the marketplace. But actually the role of data, and more importantly, data management culture, about how we ensure that we manage data and treat it as the asset that it truly is, because that's when we truly get value from it. Actually, we're increasingly seeing organizations seeing data and data management cultures supporting them on their digital transformation journey. And in terms of what that journey looks like, it's clearly going to be vary by the different subparts of the industry. It's going to vary by kind of what segments we go after. But the important point being is the role that data plays and the recognition and the understanding of the value of data in terms of the outcomes, which is clearly what this is about, the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think many organizations are on that journey, and hopefully the two examples we took you through today will give you a little bit of insight into a couple of them, and also the thinking about the how and why, more importantly, the approach that they're going to take. So hopefully you found that useful. We've just got a few minutes left, which is great. And we've had some questions come in. So Mel, I've just got a couple of questions for you here, if that's okay.
Yes,
so first of all, thanks. So in the aerospace example, how much of the collaboration and integration was there with the business in that story? And the second part of the question was, and how did the business see value then from the things that you were talking about?
Okay, so I think in terms of the real structure of driving forward any change comes from a twofold approach, and what I mean by that is that initially it's very much driven from program and project activity, but actually when we're talking about reusable information, it can't really be seen as a project task per se, because therefore it's just seen as a sort of tick box exercise, and it needs to drive forward. But what we really tried to advocate was that by getting the right stakeholders in the room and driving forward that collaboration from all over the other areas of the business, there was a real sense of enthusiasm between how just reusing, especially sort of reference data and the right definitions, made a lot of projects a lot easier that were already in the pipeline, so that it wasn't just one project leading on it, if you like. So can't give you a percentage on it, but I can say that once there was a much more recognition of a programme of work, it certainly had a much teeth to their stance.
That's great, and I love the idea of that enthusiasm, and I see that a lot, and it's great to hear organisations being really enthused by the opportunity. I think they're starting to recognise around what they can do with data, which is great. Another question I got here for you is actually on your construction example. So actually, in terms of speed and take up around the glossary and the catalogue, so I think part of the question is about how quickly they're doing that, but also I think there's a second part of the question, which is kind of what their longer term objectives are, because clearly you can see that there's potentially a lot more they could be doing.
Absolutely, and I think, like everything, it's the term start small, scale big, and the idea being that with definitely the business glossary terms and the data definitions, I think they did start off primarily as a sort of manual exercise to really understand just how many terms they actually had or thought they had, without even going into the business of trying to define those. So I think once it started to get a little bit non-manageable from a manual spreadsheet perspective, they were able to start thinking about, okay, there has to be a sort of smarter way to do this so that we can collaborate with other data owners, for example, across other business functions, to just really help them with collating that information as opposed to really defining it and locking it down. But with the data catalogue as well, that was more really to help them with other information that they need for analytics. But I guess for their longer term objectives, it will certainly be a case of investment for sort of data platforming and the ability to extrapolate and democratise the data in a much healthier way, around really just taking out the manual ineffectiveness that actually goes with that. So as they're driving more analytics and stronger sort of decision-making abilities, but how do they handle the sheer increase of data when it comes to IoT? Do they have infrastructure that can cope with that? So it's really looking at the types of data that they have now, as well as being able to define what those are.
Cool, thank you.
So Andy, I've got a couple in for you as well, if you don't mind.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Right, so first question is, when you're looking for the right tactical and strategic balance, how do organisations manage the skills and resource constraints?
Yeah, really good question. Actually, it's a question we do get quite a lot. First thing I'd say is I think skills is a major issue from an industry viewpoint. So having enough of the right people in the right place for the skills we need, that is an industry-wide problem. Having said that, I think in the role of data, then I think what we're seeing is that many organisations are starting to focus on actually the problems that they're trying to solve, and in many cases, it's about understanding kind of the size and scope of the problem. And what I mean by that is that thinking back to some of the examples that you talked about earlier, Mel, that I think about what sort of teams do you need to deliver these capabilities? And I don't mean projects, I mean capabilities. What sort of teams do you need? What sort of skills do you need? And do you have, as an organisation, those skills in-house? Do you get them from elsewhere? And what sort of blend do you need to make you successful and sustainable? So I think one is understanding the market and the ecosystem that sits out there, and not just focusing on doing everything in-house. There's a role for in-house, obviously, but not everything needs to be done in-house. I think that's part of the answer. I think another part of the answer is lots of organisations are focusing on automation and intelligence in technology to try and remove the need for some skills and some particular resources. And what I mean by that is it may well be that you have a team of people, for example, doing data stewardship, and actually maybe you can use technologies that you don't need as many people doing data stewardship. Maybe you can use those people now for doing more value-add activities in terms of onboarding projects or kind of helping the business get around more value from collaboration. I think that's the second part, which is kind of the role of technology. And I think the last part then is actually just thinking about, okay, so in terms of where we are, do we want to go and fix all the problems that we have, or do we almost want to draw a line in the sand and say, right, okay, we're just going to look at a forward-looking view of this, and we're increasingly seeing organisations saying, actually, you know, on our digital transformation, so much is going to change that actually it's almost, in some respects, it might be easy just to say, you know, here's the line in the sand. We're going to look at how we do this differently going forward to support that digital transformation, and we'll drive that as the priority, and we'll work out how we come back to the more tactical and maybe kind of run the business activities a little bit later. So we're seeing a blend of things. I think it's very much around focus and prioritization, recognizing the assets and resources you've got or you can get, and then using, I think, some technology to try and help you make the most of those assets that you've got and the skills that you've got available.
Great, thanks, Andy. Finally, I've just got one more question, if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so when you're discussing customer shifts, hasn't the recent pandemic disruption completely altered the supply chain dynamic overall?
Yeah, that's again another very, very good question. So I think it has. I think what it's done though is I think it's brought to light the fact that we've managed with the supply chain and the way it's worked, and we've done okay with that. And I think what we've now done is now we've seen stress and pressure on that supply chain, and we've seen how organisations around the world have responded to that stress and that pressure. I think what that's given us, I think that's given us the impetus, because we now recognise that actually we can do better and we can do more, and there's value in doing that. Now, it does mean that we're going to have to think differently. It does mean we're going to have to do things differently. But one of the things that we can think about, one aspect of our industry, in terms of the fact that we've had so much collaboration happening around finding a vaccine, for example. That level of collaboration, we certainly saw collaboration, but not to that extent and not to that level. And I think what we're increasingly seeing is organisations a lot more collaborative when it comes to the supply chain. I think they're also a lot more cautious in terms of, let's really understand whether we're getting into a supply chain contract or relationship, and we understand actually what that means. So does a market shift that happened, can we respond in a way that's actually the right for our business? And I think then just recognizing that we play an important role of that. And actually one of the points you were talking about, Mel, is kind of that sort of visibility of data, and actually recognizing that we are all in a part of the supply chain. So everything we individually do has to have value, and therefore if it adds value, hopefully it adds value upstream and downstream in terms of how we manage our processes. So the better we do, I think globally the supply chain dynamic I think would improve as well. So I think there's a number of things happening. It's been a tough, very tough, challenging time for many businesses. I think for me what it's done is it's shown a light on the fact that actually there's still an opportunity to do more around the supply chain and really take advantage of the fact that now that there's such a focus on it, because we've had to, that actually maybe there's a benefit to that focus, and let's turn that to something much more positive. So I think there's a great deal more that we're going to see coming on that probably in the next 6 to 9 months, but I think we're potentially in quite an interesting place in terms of where we go around supply chain. So listen, I recognise we're pretty much out of time, and I'd just like to say thank you, Mel. Great insight once again in terms of kind of bringing this to life for people. What I would like to say is that in terms of what we're doing, we'll make the recording available afterwards, and the materials will also be available too. We'll also be sharing links to the previous data management culture webinars, so you'll be able to hear the big and wider story in terms of kind of how we've got to that point. For now, what I'd just like to say is thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening. And if you do have any questions, then please feel to reach out to us on the links that we provided as part of the follow-up to this. So for now, on behalf of Mel and myself, I'd like to say thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you.